Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're joined in our Washington, D.C. studio by Bartlett Naylor from Public Citizen. He's a financial policy advocate, and by Green Party spokesperson Scott McClarty. And on the phone by David Swanson. David is the author of War is a Crime, a political activist and a political commentator. We're talking about the economic situation, the crisis in Europe, its impact on the United States and vice versa. We're also talking about the Occupy movement that has spread not only throughout the United States, but indeed throughout Europe and is part of a global movement of protest and resistance. Let's start here, gentlemen, in the studio with Bartlett Naylor. Bartlett, you're a financial policy advocate for Public Citizen. You're doing what work with the Dodd-Frank legislation, and what's the point of it?
The state of play is that the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act was approved by Congress and signed by the President in July of 2010. And now it mandated that the agencies who are in charge of implementing this 2,000-page law translate that into the rules of the road, the speed limits, if you will, on the highways for financial institutions to drive by. Some of them are fairly straightforward. Some of the rules, such as the so-called Volcker Rule, are extremely complex and address some of the intricacies.
I mean, get to the for the lay public. What's the basic law supposed to achieve in terms of a new set of regulations?
It's supposed to do two things: to prevent the kind of systemically risky activity in which banks engaged, and to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices.
Scott McClarty, there's a perception, I think, certainly given voice to by the Occupy movement, and certainly that exists throughout the country, including those who are not politically active, that Congress, the entity that's passed the Dodd-Frank that Obama signed into law, is in fact in the pockets of the banks that they bailed out, in the pockets of the corporations, and as such won't do anything meaningful to really regulate them.
Well, that's absolutely correct, and you know, a lot of the Dodd-Frank regulations were important, but they just don't go deep enough. And you know, in the Green Party, we looked at what was happening, and the real problem was the existence of these too-big-to-fail financial institutions. The federal government, the White House, Congress, they had a chance to break up the banks, to break up the largest banks into smaller regional banks whose failure would not have imperiled our national economy. And certainly, through the bailouts, the White House and Congress had the right to do that because the bailouts were essentially the purchase of a controlling interest in those corporations.
I want to bring David Swanson into the conversation. David, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Joining us by Skype.
Yeah, I hear you fine.
I'm not hearing you, but let me ask you, and let's see if we bring you in here. There was an article today in the New York Times, David, where it's reported that 1 out of 3 Americans under the age of 25 ends up being arrested at some time in their life. A huge number, 30%. We see this great economic crisis that happened in Wall Street. A lot of fraud, a lot of theft, billions of dollars bailed out, and very few people are going to jail at all. From your point of view, is there a sort of an inoculation against criminal prosecution? What explains the fact that so few bankers are standing trial?
Well, it's not the absence of laws. I hope you can hear me. It's not the absence of laws through which they might be prosecuted. It's the absence of prosecutions. It's the incredible efforts to which the Bush and Obama administrations have gone to protect them, to grant immunity, to avoid prosecutions. Yes, we have an incredible incarceration rate in this country, highest in the world. We have a crackdown on petty crimes, and in fact, that has reduced crime, but you have this disparity where those with huge power committing the most massive crimes are granted immunity through not just negligence, but huge proactive efforts by both the Congress and primarily by the Justice Department and potential prosecutors, so that you have this sense among the public that crime is permitted to occur if you're sufficiently large and powerful enough. And that's building a huge supply of resentment.
David, before we go back to our studios and our guests in studio, I want to ask you this. Bartlett Naylor for Public Citizen, a watchdog group that represents consumers and people who are not in power, is proposing a series of advisory regulations so that the Dodd-Frank bill has some teeth. In other words, where it really does regulate these big financial corporations, the banks. From your point of view, does Dodd-Frank represent a serious effort to reform, to regulate the banks, or is it something of a palliative?
Well, it's not the dramatic change that's needed. It's not breaking up the mega banks. It's not reducing them to manageable entities. It's not changing the basic structure of our economy. And it does not somehow mandate its own enforcement or the initialing of enforcement of existing laws. I mean, this is the weakness, that even if we have better laws, if they're not enforced, it won't do us a bit of good. I think the best initiative that Public Citizen is backing and deserves much credit for is the initiative to amend our Constitution to get the money out of the elections and the human rights out of corporations' hands. And that may go through Congress. It may have to go around Congress through the states. Either way, none of this is going to happen without a massive movement of public pressure, which finally, we are beginning to see the initial signs of. So I'm hopeful. These are all steps in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some audio problems for you guys in terms of being able to fully hear David Swanson. But let me tell you, Bartlett, what he said in short is that he thinks the issue is about enforcement, that some of the possibilities of Dodd-Frank are there, but if there's no will or determination to enforce, it doesn't really matter unless there's a large public opinion, which is starting to form, certainly through the Occupy movement. And the other thing David Swanson mentioned was the efforts by Public Citizen to take money out of the elections. I want you to comment on both of his points, if you would.
Well, as to the first point, I think that's exactly right. The absence of prosecutions, for example, that we've seen to date from the financial crash is evidence of regulatory capture. Namely, our policing agencies seem to view themselves more as celebrants of industry as opposed to tough cops. Currently, bank holding company penalties are minimal. When a bank violates the law, for example, this Volcker rule simply proposes that the remedy is that they cease. In other words, if you're caught for speeding, the police will come over and say, please stop speeding, but there won't be any real penalty, any real deterrent as currently provided. Regarding lobbying and political spending, yes, a Public Citizen has a very robust campaign to try to remove the influence of private sector funding, corporate spending, for example, from the electoral process. Dodd-Frank itself was not simply written by, but lobbied by a very lopsided army of lobbyists. So we counted that our side was outnumbered by Wall Street roughly 150 to 1. And while we obviously had the tragedy of the economy arguing with us and the headlines in the media, the actual human beings behind the scenes doing all this work were, unfortunately, Wall Street people, either temporarily serving in agencies to return, or they were coming right from the law firm. Sometimes they didn't even seem to remove the letterhead on the law firm before it was sent into the legislative history.
I want to go to the issue of accountability and enforcement, or stay with that issue,
yes,
in fact. And then, Scott, ask you the same thing. Citigroup just came up with a settlement of a couple $100 million with the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, the watchdog group over Wall Street. A federal district judge threw that settlement out and said it was basically a slap on the wrist for the Citigroup engaging in fraudulent criminal activity. In other words, selling goods and services, products to investors that it itself was betting against, undermining, in fact. So how does given the fact that we have an army of lobbyists for the other side, for the bankers, and that there's a lack of will to really hold these people accountable, how does it all happen? How does real change take place? I mean, if this doesn't generate change, what would?
Yes. The SEC argues that settlement is the only answer within their capacity. They have only so many employees, thanks to a conservative Congress, for example, that fails to fully fund them. They have to struggle to maintain level funding. 20,000 public companies, all of whom want to inflate their numbers, and yet there's only 3,000, maybe 4,000 SEC police. They literally, in their view, they literally cannot take each of these infractions to a full court press. That's their argument. On the other side, it's clear, based simply on the SEC's complaint against companies such as Citicorp, that bad things happened. In the 1980s, there were 10,000 criminal referrals and 1,000 convictions from the savings and loan crisis. And we're obviously seeing essentially none of that today.
So let's say that again. 10,000 criminal referrals and 1,000 convictions in 1989, 20 years ago, the last time there was a major banking crisis. So, and how does it compare to today?
I think the answer is close to zero. I mean, you're having a few insider trading cases, which really don't have too much to do with the financial crisis. But Bill Black, for example, who was one of the leaders of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, who set up a mechanism whereby bank supervisors, bank agents that go into banks, knew the questions to ask, knew the information to collect, so they could make a robust criminal referral to the Justice Department. That vocabulary does not seem to exist today.
Okay, Scott McLarty, when President Obama came into office in 2009, January 20th, he came in with a huge majority in the House of Representatives, a huge majority in the Senate, 59, with an independent senator that was almost a veto-proof number. And compared to 20 years ago, as Bartlett is saying, the number of prosecutions of bankers and those who committed fraud and wrongdoing and criminal acts has gone to almost none. I mean, what accounts for the difference? Didn't people think the Democrats would be a welcome relief compared to the Republicans?
Well, if you looked closely at Barack Obama's campaign platform, there really wasn't much change that was really part of that platform. And of course, when soon after President Obama took office, who did he hire for his economic staff? He hired Timothy Geithner as his Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers as his Chief Financial Advisor.
Timothy Geithner before was the Federal Reserve, in charge of the Federal Reserve in
for New York, yes.
During the financial meltdown.
And Bill Daley is Bill Daley is his Chief of Staff. These are all Wall Street insiders. This was a signal that the Obama administration was going to do as little as possible for genuine reform.
I want to ask you, and I also want to bring David Swanson back into the conversation. Okay, why? What's the reason? What's the reason that the Democratic Party, with its huge majority,
well, you know as well as I do that Barack Obama has received more contributions from Wall Street.
Is that what explains it? You think it's because
that partly explains it, but it also the legalized corruption, the pervasive influence of Wall Street money in both political parties. I belong to a party, the Green Party, that accepts no corporate money at all, and we reject corporate influence.
Let's bring David Swanson in. David, I want to ask you the same question. We've sort of established in the course of the conversation here that President Obama and not just the personality, but the Democratic Party, when they were in charge, has done much less than was done, say, in 1989 during the savings and loan crisis in terms of the prosecution of crooks and thieves who are running the U.S. financial system. How do you think about that? Why?
Well, I agree with Scott. Of course, there is much more money in the electoral system now. There is much greater corruption. There actually were some good campaign promises from candidate Obama, and he has gone back on just about every good one that he made. And there is corruption within our society, within our activist community, within what I call the nonprofit industrial complex. There are too many groups with good positions who are willing to compromise, look the other way, not even notice what's being done to them when it's done by a Democrat. And so there's not been an independent pushback against this the way that there was even when Bush was in the White House. This movement that's beginning, this Occupy movement, has something going for it in that it's been thus far fairly independent, fairly principled outside of either of these big political parties. And that, of course, is what's going to begin to change this, if anything is. You know, and it doesn't mean picking the right bill or picking the right elected official to get behind and compromise ourselves for, but it means stopping the foreclosures one by one and through local and state legislation. It means organizing the students to en masse refuse to pay back outrageous student loan debt. It means taking action outside of our political system, changing our culture, and building a society in which both of these parties, some other party, independents, are all collectively moved in the right direction. Whereas right now...
I want to ask you, David, and I'll translate it for the studio guests who are not hearing you fully, is because I want to ask them the same thing. Okay, the Occupy movement, as you're saying, is an independent movement, not beholden to the Democrats. It's not about a particular bill. It's about a sort of a sea change. But then again, what would be the program that would carry out the kind of change? What would it actually do that would make the kind of meaningful reforms or revolutionary reforms that would alter the political power, the economic power of the banks and the big corporations, and how would it look? How would it look in terms of the political manifestations, the reforms themselves? David, I'll ask you, and then I'll bring in the studio guests.
Well, if you look at what the President's Deficit Commission and then the failed super committee discussed and the topics they avoided, including fairly taxing the wealthy and the corporations and including cutting back the massive investment in war preparation, and then you look at what was produced by our own People's 99% Deficit Commission there in Freedom Plaza at OccupyWashingtonDC.org, the contrast is stunning. And you now have legislation introduced in the House by the so-called Progressive Caucus that goes some measure in the direction of what was proposed out of Freedom Plaza. That is significant reforms. That is shifting who gets taxed and who doesn't, where the money gets invested, where it doesn't. It is subjecting everyone to the rule of law, not just those of us without the money. The reforms are not hard to come up with. The bills are not hard to write. It's the political will and pressure to make it happen that's just beginning to grow.
Okay, and David Swanson, I want to thank you for having joined us here by Skype. I'm going to translate your answers now for the studio guests, and thanks again for being with us. What David Swanson was just mentioning is that the reforms themselves are not that complicated. They're easily discernible that there was an alternative program to the budget deficit super committee's proposal that was developed by activists, say, at Freedom Plaza. It was detailed, it was specific. He said that the issue really isn't about what to do, it's about the will to do it. I want to, though, ask you, Bartlett, what would it, if you were in charge, what would you do?
In 1987, on August 3rd, this problem started when the Senate voted 96-2 to confirm Alan Greenspan as the Federal Reserve chairman. He started several decades of deregulation that played out on September 15th with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, when banks transformed from being relatively prudent intermediators of savers with users of capital into proprietary trading. Rip your face off, bankers. What I would do is rewind the clock, establish some of those laws that we had in place since the 1930s, Glass-Steagall, smaller banks, and reduce banks from 20% of the GDP to 10%. At 20% of the GDP, they are the bonus bloating that attracts too many of our best students from universities and PhD programs to simply sustain that problem. Yes, we need the will. Occupy, in my opinion, represents the anger, if you will. And there certainly is a great deal of intelligence of many of the people that I've talked to who align themselves with Occupy. The problem is that the answers available today don't match the anger. And what is needed are answers, proposals, such as breaking up the banks that are far larger than some of the questions being asked today, such as the implementation of the Dodd-Frank law.
Now we know that capitalism has gone through many stages and phases of its development over the past couple hundred years. And I'm just wondering if what we're witnessing is a new stage of capitalism, what some people call the financialization of capitalism, where, and especially in the United States, the percentage of GDP occupied by the financial sector compared, say, to manufacturing, which was the hallmark of industrial development, is such that this kind of bubble-creating, speculative-driven economic output, or not output, just economic activity, actually constitutes a new phase of at least the Western capitalist model. Bartlett, your answer, and then I'm ask Scott.
I think that's right, and I think it's self-defeating because finance depends on draining money, draining value from everything else. You can buy a computer today for $500 that does $20,000, $100,000 worth of computing that was available 20 years ago. If our finance industry truly had been innovative and had improved, it would have gone from 10% of the GDP down to 5%. It would have delivered that same value. Instead, it's gone the opposite way, not because it's become more efficient, but it's become less efficient. My colleague here was a Teamster. I used to work for the Teamsters. Trucking is an intermediate industry. If you said the trucking industry once represented 10% of the industry and now it's 20%, you'd ask, what's wrong with the truckers? Are they driving half full? Are they getting lost? It would be a problem. And yet, of course, we're told by the financial industry that we need to celebrate that it's a core industry. In fact, it's a cancer.
Scott, same thing to you.
Well, first of all, I want to say that there's really we really don't have much of a chance of systematic change in our financial regulations, in our economic system, as long as the political playing field is limited to two parties that are funded by these large corporations, by the financial sector, including Wall Street. We can identify several ways in which Democrats, not just Republicans, were responsible for that. It was Bill Clinton, who took the Democratic Party quite far to the right, who signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall, who signed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, which essentially that deregulated the derivatives and other arcane
and he signed NAFTA.
Kinds of securities.
He started the free trade.
He started NAFTA. And so you can pretty much count on Democratic presidents now to pass legislation, to enact policies that Republicans themselves proposed, but they themselves were not able to enact. We moved into a very dangerous period. Let me address your particular question.
Sure.
A little bit more right now. We are in a new stage of capitalism that people need to understand, but I think that one of the parts of this that is very, very serious is that government has become so much a servant of corporate elites, of the oligarchs, that they've essentially merged. When people complain about big government, we do have a problem with big government, but it's big government that whose main function is to serve these very powerful elites.
Well, the U.S. government, since the inception of the Republic, served the interests of the well-to-do, the affluent, the wealthy.
Sure.
The divergence from that model or that pattern happened in the 1930s when there was a somewhat of a revolutionary upsurge here, and then
Certainly.
the government came in with Social Security Act and all the other attendant legislation from that.
There have been some other divergences too, such as that occurred during the rise of the populists and the Progressive Party, which put an end to the robber baron era. But we've kind of moved into a robber baron era, and it's sort of on corporate on turbo drive right now. And we don't know what to do about it. The only thing that people have been able to do is get out in the streets and protest, and that is absolutely necessary. But we also need to take some steps beyond that to make sure that very specific policies are enacted that make for systematic changes. As I said before, these too large to fail financial institutions, these banks, these Wall Street corporations, they need to be broken up. They need to be regionalized so that if one of them or two of them goes into a financial crisis of some kind, it doesn't wreck the entire national or global economy.
Okay, Bartlett, let's talk about the reasons that there's not significant reform. I mean, the economy's in a crisis. It's a structural crisis. It's not simply the cyclical boom bust. The recovery is taking off now after a downturn. Scott says the big banks should be broken up. But isn't it the case that the big banks are actually stronger now than they've ever been? I mean, in terms of their political influence and political power. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is whether we've entered some sort of phase of the development of capitalism, or at least U.S. capitalism, that isn't easily malleable by political intervention, especially when the politicians are getting their money from the same banks and corporations.
I think that's exactly right. Andrew Sheng, who was essentially the Federal Reserve Chairman for China, says that in China, the biggest corporations or the biggest enterprises are all run by former engineers. They went to very good engineering schools. They know how to build things, how to run things. If you look at American corporations, not simply banks, but many corporations, they're run by the finance guy. Not somebody who not even salespeople. It used to be the best salesman rose to be the head of General Motors. Now it's the accounting guy, the finance guy, because the game, even outside Wall Street, is to have mergers. That's where, I've become a bigger company, and that's what I celebrate. In a crisis, government, and then they in turn infuse government, and we saw, it's called government sacks in Washington. They are all over the place, not just Goldman Sachs, but JP Morgan. You can find them everywhere. And in a crisis, as Mr. Sheng said of China, you help your own. That's who you go to first. Even Paul Volcker, for example, much as I personally respect him, said we need to save the banks. We need to decide which banks to save, but we do need to save the banks because they're crucial. But recall during the financial crisis, we passed TARP. I don't know, it took 8 days to pass the biggest expenditure in world history in about 8 days. We argued a long time about support for General Motors, as we should have, but it demonstrates the reflexiveness to helping, if you will, Wall Street, helping the moneyed interests. The answer, I agree with Scott, break up the banks. They need to be much smaller. It would be nice if our government had in its highest levels of advice people who came from Main Street.
We'll continue the discussion after a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the second segment of 2.5 Hours. We're here in our Washington, D.C. studio discussing the economic crisis that's ravaged the United States, Europe, and given rise to a new global protest movement. Gentlemen, let's continue where we left off. Scott, I want I want to get your take on the Occupy movement, because clearly it's got a spontaneous element to it. It's taken off in the last 3 months. It's September 17th. Every day there's new activities. But what people say about it is that it doesn't have a program. In other words, it's a protest movement or a movement of anger, but it doesn't have a solution to society's crisis. And some of the Occupy people say, well, we're creating a sort of an alternative reality. But given the way modern industry and urban living is, requiring integrated supply and demand, et cetera, do you see that the movement will morph now into a position where it has to go from protest to actually having a political program?
I think that it has to evolve into a movement that includes all sorts of activities. Street protest has to continue, and I look forward to seeing protests outside the Democratic and Republican national conventions.
That'll be in August of
2012. Yes.
Yeah.
There also needs to be an electoral component. I'm a member of the Green Party. The Green Party reflects the Green Party's platform, its positions, its principles reflect the basic ideals of the Occupy protesters. And there are other strategies too, such as boycott. A lot of people have been motivated to withdraw their money from some of these large banks and put their investments in much smaller banks and credit unions. There are a number of different things that people can do. There are a lot of challenges that are coming up. Remember that in 2010, last year, January, the Supreme Court passed the Citizens United ruling, which removed limits on campaign advertising by corporations. And I think we're going to see an onslaught of really ugly, deceptive political campaign ads that are meant to discredit the Occupy movement and deceptively associate President Obama and the Democrats with the Occupy movement, too. There really isn't.
Both parties are happy to take money in ample amounts from all of these unnamed and unlimited sources of income. The thing that I'm wondering, though, in terms of where the movement goes, and Bartlett, I'll ask you the same question. If you're unemployed or underemployed, and when you look at all the numbers, it's somewhere above 30 million people who are unemployed or underemployed or stopped looking for work because they just gave up. That number hasn't gone down. In fact, it's gone up. They want to protest against the situation, but more than anything, they want jobs. How do they get jobs? Where do the jobs come from? How does it happen? And if it doesn't happen, won't this lead to a growing sort of political radicalization in the country?
And I think Occupy actually does grow from the dynamic of this 30 million unemployed or underemployed. I think one of the surprises of why Occupy has engaged public attention, when certainly we've had this problem for several years, is that I think we first hoped that the Obama presidency would help solve some of these problems. It hasn't really solved significantly the chief problem of unemployment and a stagnant economy. And so now we have this somewhat intangible but very loud protest. I don't know where it goes, beyond my pay grade, other than to embrace it. One of my worries is having, for example, worked on strikes. For example, in the Detroit newspaper strike, which had 2,000 journalists out on strike, and we commanded media attention, not simply because it was a large strike, but also because it had reporters. But after a while, media covers what is new. And if it's in its 5th month or 8th month and it's not new, then I'm concerned that it will lack the command of public attention. And therefore, what does Occupy have to do? And I think it has to do some of the things that you're talking about. Translate this into specific reforms, specific questions that are being asked now, as well as bigger issues. Case in point, the financial transactions tax, which is a proposal to put a minuscule tax on a transaction. You know, if you go buy a cup of coffee for $2, you're going to pay 30 cents in tax. If you buy or sell securities on Wall Street, you pay zero. There's a proposal by DeFazio and Harkin in Congress to put 0.03% tax on a transaction. If the average 401k person invests $3,000 a year, that's a few dollars. And yet the fact that that bill, which could raise roughly $100 billion a year, is going essentially nowhere, demonstrates the very tight grip of Wall Street. Can Occupy, if it infuses the public debate more, both in the media but at Thanksgiving and Christmas meals, to actually break that connection between Wall Street and Washington, is what I hope will be the black swan that actually, you know, moves us forward.
In the recent days here in Washington, D.C., and demonstrating the tremendous political gridlock, the House and Senate and the White House have been unable to come up with a bill that would extend the tax cut for the payroll tax cut, which is on Social Security. And so the estimate is that most wage earners, salary earners, in other words, the 99%, will see their taxes go up by perhaps $1,000 a year starting next year. At the same time, 1.6 million people who are long-term unemployed and receiving long-term unemployment benefits, they will have those benefits expire. And again, in spite of the fact that we have these monumental problems, Congress has done nothing so far to extend the unemployment benefits. Is the Congress and the political establishment, in addition to the influence of Wall Street, also under the sort of domination of the extreme right wing in America?
There are different kinds of right wing. There's the social right wing, which was which is represented by social conservatives like Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry, and that's one kind of conservatism. But the kind of conservatism, and I actually would not call it conservatism, I'd call it a kind of radicalism, which is represented by the power of Wall Street and other corporate elites over our political system. That's much more entrenched, and it's going to be very difficult to get rid of it. Again, as I said before, as long as the political landscape is limited to these two parties that are addicted to that kind of money.
But there is a difference here between the Democrats and the Republicans. I understand your point, but I want to just explain for our listeners what the difference is. President Obama says the unemployment benefits that are long-term unemployment benefits should be extended. That would not be considered anything other than normal during a period of high unemployment. That the payroll tax, which is a $1,000 a year tax for working class families, that should continue.
Look, we need a jobs program that's far beyond.
No, but I mean, I'm just talking about this. Why can't President Obama achieve that? Why can't, I mean, what's going on in Congress, Bartlett, that's preventing that from happening?
I believe it's as simple as whatever Obama wants, his conservative opponents will oppose. And it has to do with projection of power, and I think they don't want Obama to project power.
Okay, President Obama said, or maybe not him, maybe it was the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party, the so-called Progressive Caucus, that there should be, no, I think it was the Democratic Party position, that there should be a surcharge, a small surcharge, a tax on millionaires, those making more than $1 million per year. The Republicans said, no, absolutely not. Those millionaires are job creators, and taxing them will diminish the job prospects. And yet they're going to go ahead and pass a huge, what amounts to a huge per capita tax increase for working class and middle class people. That's the conservative or extremist or radical position. Why doesn't President Obama say to the people of the country, to the unemployed, come out and stand up and demonstrate, come into the streets to stop this terrible miscarriage of justice from happening? Why can't he do that? Why can't he use the bully pulpit for that?
Well, I welcome such an appeal. I believe that you're seeing, there is a glimmer of hope that when Obama has begun to talk about Wall Street by name as the culprit for this problem, as he did about a week and a half ago, that we might be seeing that type of rhetoric. Again, rhetoric that we welcome. We're much focused on the fight of Richard Cordray to become the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's the half of the Dodd-Frank that's supposed to protect citizens against abusive practices by bankers. And that contest, if you will, is playing out right now, unfortunately, within Senate rules. We asked the president to come out and use his constitutional authority, and now you're seeing the Senate minority leader and so forth talk about foul play, even though from our point of view, it's House members who have effectively stopped the Senate from adjourning to allow this. All of this is inside baseball, and I guess I raised this example because I think our members of Congress are playing inside baseball, and they are oblivious to what their constituents are thinking. They are running off a cliff. We see 8% approval rating for Congress. I think they don't know what to do other than to play games, and I would like to think that they will awaken from that and adopt some policies that are far more progressive and far more enlightened and aware of what America really needs.
And we know that
change the subject a little bit.
We know that President Obama, when he does go into negotiation with Republicans, he tends to march into battle armed with retreats and capitulations, and we saw that very dramatically this past summer during the budget discussions. But you know, a minute ago you identified something that's absolutely necessary, and that is for people to stand up and to make their voices heard, to get out in the streets if they want. There are a number of other ways to make their voices heard too. And it's not just the unemployed. There are students that are facing crushing debt from their what they owe their colleges that they just graduated from, and you know, they're not able to find jobs that are able to match what they were looking for, or to be able to pay back their debt. Also, working people that do have jobs are facing loss of benefits and job security. And let's remember that almost a year ago, January of 2011, we saw a kind of a foretaste of the Occupy protests in Wisconsin when Governor Walker went on the attack against benefits and job security for public sector jobs, but also that took place in Ohio, but also in New York with Governor Cuomo, a Democratic governor. So people need to stand up and be heard, but also they need to use their power, their power to vote. There is a tremendous tendency, even when Congress and the White House are getting low poll numbers, when there's widespread dissatisfaction, for people to go to the voting booths and to vote for incumbents or to vote straight party line. What we really need to see is a kind of a voters' rebellion, and a rebellion against these two parties, the two parties of war and Wall Street.
Let me change the subject if I could. I want to talk about the fact that it's not just the U.S. economic crisis. We are in a global economy, and there is a global economic crisis. And no country, regardless of what particular model or system they're using, is completely inoculated from the impact. People are buying and selling and trading and interacting with each other on all kinds of levels, more so internationally and globally than ever before. Bartlett, you pay attention to finance. You have a lot of experience with it. You were a Senate banking staff member in the 1980s during the last banking crisis. I want you to comment, if you would, about what's going on in Europe. We see that periodically and more regularly, the leaders of Germany and France and others are gathering together, making big pronouncements about how to overcome the sovereign debt crisis of certain countries, how to reorganize the European Union to make it more than just a currency union. And yet there seems to be no end in sight. And Britain has taken itself out of the discussion, even though it's part of the EU. Mm-hmm. What's your view of Europe? Where is it going? What's its impact on the United States? The big picture.
Yeah, well, both assessing Europe and recommending remedy is well beyond my pay grade, as I think it apparently is beyond the pay grade of the people that are in charge, as far as I can tell. The argument of profligate spending that is to say, government spending beyond which the economy or taxes can pay back, is what is prominent right now. That's what our finance leaders in the various countries are saying. But as Scott is saying, in a bad economy, one needs to dip in to future obligations. And to the extent that an economy is hurting now, I think what's necessary is additional spending and not belt-tightening.
Well, that certainly is not the program that's being offered.
I appreciate that.
The austerity, Greek workers and the middle class have seen their living standards decline by as much as 30% in a short few months. That's the kind of precipitous decline in living standards that is usually associated with a war. Naturally, people are in the streets, but if you have austerity, how then does the economy grow to generate more income to be able to even pay back banks and banks' interest in addition to keeping the living standards of the people?
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing what Scott says, because I appreciate the anecdote or the stories that come out about Greece are not unlike the stories you heard from Wisconsin, namely that these government workers who were allowed to retire 1 year after working, and they weren't particularly productive. I don't think that's probably truly the case. These countries have been buffeted by a number of financial shenanigans, some at the hands of American financial companies who had some trading profits, who had some speculative goals in mind. And now you're seeing play out now a problem such as in Greece that was exacerbated by, for example, an interest rate swap that took place roughly 8 or 9 years ago by a U.S. bank and Greece to essentially get them through a short-term problem, but in fact it built up a much deeper bubble. Unfortunately, as with the housing bubble in the United States, provided that everybody is essentially making money, nobody does the rational thing at the right time. And that is to say, I don't think housing prices can go up 10% a year. Something is wrong. But provided everybody's making money, there's no incentive to stop that. So what happened in Greece, the seeds of that may have happened roughly 10 years ago. I don't know that we need to tell Greece that they need to suffer for the next 20 years to get out of it. I think that
well, it's not just Greece now in terms of austerity. There's have
Italy,
Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and even the bigger economies like Italy, and even bigger economies like the French economy, where the direction is to tell the masses of people that they must live with less, that they have to tighten their belts. But the bottom line is to pay the interest back and the principal to bankers. Why not just have, say, a moratorium on debt payments to the banks? Why not nationalize the banks? Why is everything in Europe held hostage to the domination of the banks? They have a different political system than here, so it's not the Democrats and Republicans. What's the dynamic?
But there is still something in common, and that is that when there is a crisis of this kind, they believe that the remedy is to transfer the debt, impose austerity on the working people, on the citizens of these countries, the people who in no way are responsible for having for the behavior that caused these crises. And on the other hand, the flip side of this is that the financial elites have been indulged, and there's no real motive for change when you send several $1 trillion to the without any kind of conditions to these CEOs, to these very large companies that were responsible for the financial collapse. We should have seen, and this goes for any country. We should always see that that any kind of bailout is not just a love gift to these firms, not just an emergency care package to get them through a little difficult time, and they can use this care package as they want. We should see these bailouts as a kind of purchase of controlling interest in these banks and other financial institutions. And once the government has a controlling interest in these companies, and I say government, but it's really the people. We're democratic countries, so it's really the people. The people have a controlling interest in these companies. They have the right to say, okay, now you're going to break up You're going to change all these practices that were so detrimental in the past. We can impose these rules, these conditions on you. From now on, you'll be much smaller banks, so any damage from a crisis like this will be very, very limited regionally.
Okay, that seems rational. That seems like
we're rational people, Brian.
That's a logical program. But again, I want to confront or ask you, Bartlett, to challenge the seeming logic and rationality of the program, diminish the role of the banks, break them up, make them smaller, with what's actually happening, which is that the fiscal union of the European Union is requiring those sovereign countries to basically give up sovereign control over their own budgets. In other words, the German and more dominant powers, capitalist powers in Europe, are telling Portugal, Greece, Ireland, Spain, you have to subject your budgetary decisions, which are policy decisions and ethical decisions about how money is spent, who it serves. You have to give it to a central organization dominated by the German banking system. Doesn't that negate basic democratic principles?
Yes, and it is. And I'm afraid it's going to be difficult for me to take too much exception with Scott. But to the extent that that's what the price of the euro is for some somewhat intangible or some promise of economic efficiency between borders, I think is an intangibility too far. In other words, I think we do need to respect the integrity of Greeks and Italians and Portuguese to decide on their own how they're going to apportion their taxes and how they're going to jumpstart their own economy. I appreciate that it might promote big corporations who have markets across borders and so forth, but I think that is very much at odds with the very democratic and self-determination that you're discussing.
We're glad to be joined now by Skype by Ted Rall, political cartoonist and commentator, maybe by phone, I think. Ted, we're talking about Europe and the negation of democracy that we see as the German bankers demand that the sovereign countries of Europe give up their own control over their own budgets and decisions because they must be able to satisfy the demands of the Germans that they will be able to pay their bills. What's your take on Europe?
Well, it's an extremely disturbing trend and a move in exactly the opposite direction that I would want to see if I were a citizen of Europe. Clearly, you lose national sovereignty, you are headed down a dangerous path. And if anything, the current crisis of global capitalism has a lot to do with entrenched globalization and increased interconnectedness, which has eliminated the social safety net and created a lot of instability. And here, in case of the European Union, the whole thing should never have happened in the first place, and it should just be dissolved. They should go back to their sovereign currencies and let each country, figure out what is best for their own monetary policy. But that's not what they're doing, and it just seems really like a crazy last-ditch effort that's only going to make things worse before the inevitable conclusion that the euro is unsustainable.
Well, the last time Europe was in a gigantic economic crisis was in the 1930s. We saw then that the inability of the existing elites and status quo to satisfy the economic crisis led to a political paralysis, a political polarization, and ultimately the triumph of fascism in Europe, not simply in Germany and Italy, but in fact in almost every country in the continent. The Occupy movement is a growing movement. It's a movement of protest and anger, as our studio guests have said. But from your point of view, does it have or can it develop a program which provides an alternative to the current crisis of capitalism and the apparent negation of democracy?
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, the situation now is really playing into the hands of the global revolutionary movement, of which Occupy is one of them. 20 years ago, I remember studying and attending forums about globalization and the World Trade Organization and the GATT and all those early agreements. And being very dispirited and thinking that global capitalism was so firmly entrenched and interconnected that there was no way for labor to ever be able to negotiate effectively against management, because labor is not fluid. Labor is trapped behind international borders, but management is fluid. You know, you can open a factory in say Kazakhstan, but you can't go work in say the UAE unless you are a citizen of the UAE. So but what has transpired is, in fact, exactly the opposite. That globalization has turned out to be a double-edged sword. And now what you really have is a situation analogous to 15 men who have been tied together by a rope, and if one of them can't swim, they're all going to drown. And that's the situation now. I mean, it's really kind of amazing that the structure that they built is a structure that is going to bring them down. And I think at this point, the big concern is not so much whether revolution is possible. The real question is, will revolution have a chance to take hold before collapse happens? And collapse really does seem inevitable.
So, Ted, I want to thank you very much. How does the revolution in our last 2 minutes, how does it manifest? And you said it's Scott, that it's the question of the corporate elites versus democracy or something like that. But ultimately, there exists property which is used to produce materials that society, modern life, needs to sustain itself. Is the property privately owned or publicly owned? In other words, do we get down to the issue of democracy requiring that property be taken out of the hands of the dominant elites? And if so, isn't that a kind of socialism?
Sure.
You have 90 seconds, so 45 seconds for both of you for the future.
Well, we need a kind of a program, and I would recommend that people look at the Green Party. We have something called the Green New Deal, which addresses a lot of this. We needed the kind of systematic changes that allow people to understand that this property, the property, even when it's private, it affects a lot of other people, and there's no such thing as an economic situation in which people are all islands. We have to realize some kind of collective responsibility and how we deal with our economic system.
Bartlett, I want to give you the final word. Whenever we're in a situation where there's crisis, the conventional wisdom is, this is because it must be. This system is because it's the best system going, until there's a profound, radical reorganization of the economy. From your point of view in the last few seconds, where could it go that would be a genuine alternative?
We've socialized the bank losses. That's what the bailout meant. And Occupy is teaching a lesson that apparently we didn't realize was not learned before, and that was income equality. We will not succeed until we do, and I think that's the promise of Occupy. It has come from apparently nowhere. We did not predict this, and the promise is it going to lead us to understanding that we've socialized the losses, so let us socialize the management of the future.
Well, before all revolutions, people say they're impossible, and then afterwards, when we look back, we could say, well, we saw that coming. It was inevitable because of chronic, unresolvable problems. I want to thank you, Scott McLarty from the Green Party, Bartlett Naylor from Public Citizen, our guests who joined us by phone. I'm Brian Becker. We'll see you next time.